Hey, what's up, y'all? I'm Ofosu Jones-Corte. I'm one of the meditation coaches on the Balance app, along with my dear friend, Leah Santa Cruz, and this is our weekly show, Well Balanced, where we explore ways to live a healthier, happier life. Leah, unfortunately, isn't here right now because we are recording in the middle of the day, my time, which is East Coast US time, and that means it's the middle of the night in Bali, Indonesia, where Leah lives. And I know last week we said we'd have another episode from our time together in Mexico, and that is still coming, but something more pressing has come up. I'm taping this on Tuesday, January 31st, and something happened over the weekend that we both felt we needed to talk about. The release of the body cam footage of the police that beat Tyre Nichols to death at the beginning of January. Upon hearing that the footage had been released and even just seeing a still of it, the next day I really felt exhausted. I almost felt sick, and it was hard for me to get out of bed. It was hard for me to do anything. I'm wondering how I should be taking care of myself right now, and how Black people should be taking care of themselves, and how we as a society should be taking care of ourselves in the wake of all this. So I brought someone in who I think can help me and all of us unpack how to take care of ourselves in response to this traumatic news, to the traumatic images, and just the general climate that has arrived yet again. Her name is Dr. Maryam Jernigan-Noesi, and she's a psychologist with decades of experience as a clinical researcher. She's a professor and the head of Intersections Research Lab at Agnes Scott College, where she investigates the effect of experiences of discrimination on health outcomes. Dr. Jernigan-Noesi, it's a pleasure to be with you.
It is a pleasure to be with you. I appreciate you inviting this topic and having the conversation.
Thank you so much. So I'll just start with sharing a bit of where I am like today in this moment. After a few days now of the footage being released, I've arrived at the decision to not watch it. I posted on my social media, just the simple words, I'm not watching it. And I got a lot of responses. Some people told me, don't watch it. You'll deeply regret it if you see it. We're talking about a man who was murdered on film, beaten to death by 5 police officers. It's being broadcast and shared across social media. And I think many of us, particularly Black people, are heartbroken and exhausted. And I'm curious, my first question is, what's your take? Do you feel that for me as a Black person, is it my responsibility to watch this footage, or is it okay for me to protect myself by not watching it?
It's interesting because I think, as you said, we're sort of here in 2023, and yet it feels like we've been here before.
Yeah.
Especially as we think about, more access to sort of video recordings of violence against Black bodies in particular. I'm pretty adamant, both as a psychologist, as you noted, as someone that's been very personally, but also professionally invested in understanding the impact of race-related stress and trauma. I unequivocally, and I think on my professional social media, have said, do not watch the video. That's what I posted. Do not watch.
Yeah.
You can't unsee it.
Right.
Actually, this past weekend, I was with a group of psychologists, and we were processing the past few weeks, but in particular, the release of the Tyre Nichols video. One of my elders, who was one of my advisors in the field of psychology, said, I think for some folks, there's this idea that by bearing witness, right, that they are not looking away, right, from the sort of pain and the experience, and can sort of, it's almost, sort of testify to the fact that this has happened. But it comes at such I think, an exponential cost emotionally and otherwise for folks. And I think there are so many ways that we can honor, sort of Tyre Nichols and sort of take accountability and responsibility, right, for the violence, especially towards Black folks and against Black bodies. So when I sort of look at, again, this idea of the impact and the consequence, and I agree with you. I'm very adamant. I've protected myself. I did catch like a corner of a still shot and sort of zoomed by it really quickly. But the way that you sort of described waking up and sort of trying to figure out what's going on with me, for me, as you were talking, I was like, this is, right, sort of the work that's been done by scholars with regard to the effects of race-related stress and trauma, feeling it in our bodies, sort of feeling exhausted, the fatigue that comes along with it. And it's just really challenging, right? Considering the historical and, cultural trauma associated with events like this one to move through.
Yeah, I really appreciate hearing your clinical perspective on this. And I'm curious, how are you doing right now? Yeah, personally, how are you doing today?
It's interesting. I had a different moment than you. I was working, actually preparing for a workshop that I was leading on Saturday with psychologists on anti-Blackness and anti-Black racism, scheduled long ago. And Friday night, really tired from just a long week of work. And I told myself I'm going to get rest. I'm going to finally have, good 7-8 hours of sleep. I'll wake up, go do this workshop. And I popped awake at 4 a.m. And I got out of bed. It wasn't, sort of insomnia. It was like, I am wide awake. I cannot go back to sleep. And I turned to my partner and said, I need to get up, but I felt an urgency to run. And I literally went down to my sort of gym garage, which, came from COVID. And as soon as I stepped 2 feet on that treadmill, it hit me. I said, Maryam, you do this work. But it didn't connect in the same way that you were talking about that sort of disconnect of I'm really tired. I said, you know what this is about. The urgency to run was about my need to sort of release what I had been holding on to, sort of pieces of the news story. I was like, you are living out, right? Your research, but certainly as a Black identified woman, this is, right? Sort of this is the impact. And so what helped me, I will say, I actually did run, did some sprints for about 30 minutes. And that helped, I'll be honest, just the sort of the release. And then I was in community, right, with some other folks that I could process with and that I knew sort of understood and could have the conversation with me. And that also helped. But it's heavy, right? And part of the problem is we try to kind of go on with our day-to-day lives while kind of living and sitting with both the psychological as well as the physiological impact.
Ooh, so that's a great segue, psychological and physiological impact. If you wouldn't mind for our listeners, could you share a bit about what exactly race-related trauma looks like, how it shows up?
The terminology that I hear most often, right, is racial trauma. I think that's the one since 2020 and the murder of George Floyd that the general public as well as scholars, right, in this area have used. But prior to that, we had a bunch of ways that we describe this phenomenon of really understanding the physical and the psychological experience that people of color have as a result of direct and indirect experiences of witnessing or experiencing racial discrimination, racism. But in essence, from a clinical perspective, there have been scholars, mostly scholars of color, and psychologists and mental health professionals of color who have said for decades that the experience of racism, right, on all levels, being exposed to racism, and in particular, racial harassment, racial violence, racial discrimination, has harmful effects on the emotional well-being of individuals. The newest kind of emergence of that is, our exposure to social media, to cameras, right, have allowed for more exposure, sort of indirect, right, exposure. In other words, watching the video, right? We weren't necessarily there, but we are there, right, because the video captured the events. And so part of the language of racial trauma emerged because clinicians and folks kind of on the ground noted that when working with people of color, who had directly experienced or indirectly, had been exposed to racism, racial discrimination, racial violence, racial harassment, they're seeing very similar symptoms that we see as mental health providers that folks who are experiencing traumatic stress have. So that can include, as I mentioned earlier with myself, insomnia. That can include, we talk about executive functioning, right, in the brain. And so how important our brain is with regard to our ability to make decisions, to focus and to concentrate. But also folks experience headaches, right? Body aches. One of the, I think, things that's interesting to me that folks don't often talk about, in addition to those kind of physiological symptoms, is that for some individuals, they also begin to experience guilt and shame. Right. And so it's like the intra-psychic experience. And I think that's hard for folks to understand because it's, well, if this is racism, why would one feel guilty? But it's sort of the confusion that comes along with why is this happening for folks. In addition, I think if folks have medical conditions, that are exacerbated by stress, right? So we see some of the same sort of flare-ups of some of those medical conditions. In some cases, I've certainly worked with folks that may lead to, again, some medical diagnoses or conditions that are often facilitated by sort of increased stress or even toxic stress.
There's some emotion that's arising here when you mentioned the guilt and shame piece, because it is something that I experience, and it's hard to understand, like, why am I feeling this way?
Mm-hmm.
And some of that has come up also with like my decision to really keep my distance from ingesting the news cycle. Like,
Mm-hmm.
should I, we've established the ongoing issue. We've
Mm-hmm.
established what some of the impacts are, what they can look like. If we could talk a little bit about how we can care for ourselves. For me, a lot of my work centers around self-compassion and
Mm-hmm.
self-care, and using mindfulness as an avenue to practice self-compassion. I'm curious to learn from you. What are some ways that we can care for ourselves in moments like this,
Yeah,
and with the unfortunate knowledge that this won't be the last
that's right.
time we come up with something like this.
Yeah, the first thing I'll start with is where you sort of ended, and that is we think about some of the overlap, right, with regard to just trauma in general. One of the reasons why I think myself and others have been so adamant in highlighting the uniqueness of racial trauma in particular is because of what you just stated, that racism still exists, right,
Yeah.
and isn't likely to go away tomorrow. And so, unlike some of the other ways that we have described, sort of situations that may lead to a traumatic stress response as like a singular incident, right, or a
Right.
particular event, racism we know can happen at an interpersonal level, but it also, exposure institutionally and systemically, right, is also a factor. I start with an article that I actually co-authored with some of my colleagues in 2015, and that was
Mm.
following, right? So the last sort of national conversations and protests due to violence against Black bodies, and it is free and accessible to everyone online. It's been there since 2015. I wish it wasn't still relevant, but it is, and it is
Yeah.
literally hashtag racial trauma is real.
Mm.
And we have a racism recovery toolkit. So we
Wow.
actually walk folks through in this free accessible document our recommendations for both coping in the moment, but then also moving towards thinking about how it is that we heal, which actually, for me, it's the first thing is acknowledging that there is no one right or wrong way to react, that we're all
Yeah.
different. We all have our own sort of experiences and histories and awarenesses. So it is just sort of recognizing that when we are having a response and not sort of moving into that space of comparing it to someone else, but really holding the fact that we individually and collectively are likely to respond to situations in a different way. How do we create space and room for that to really
Yeah.
acknowledge, right, the range of emotions? So let's give room, I would say, first and foremost, and make sure that we're curating spaces for people to be able to do that. Business as usual often takes away
Yeah.
from our ability to do that. So I think there's something powerful also in acknowledging what's happening in society as folks come to work or as youth, sort of enter into academic spaces. It's not business as usual. So there's
Right.
that first piece. I do think, as I mentioned for myself as a psychologist, and I think even an introverted psychologist, though,
Mm.
discussion can be helpful, but it can happen in different ways. It allows us to externalize, right, our feelings. So when we have feelings of sadness or anger or anxiety that we hold on to, we know that that impacts our emotional as well as our physiological well-being. So for me, it's sort of taking inventory of, would it be helpful for me to talk, but also who, right? So I'm not going to social media and getting into a debate, right,
Right.
about the incident, which may further, right, be to the detriment of my well-being. It's ensuring that I have, as I did, right, some folks that I'm connected to, where I don't feel like I have to
Yeah.
over-explain my perspective, but it's truly going to be, right, folks that can listen and be supportive, recognizing when, again, we may all be impacted.
Right.
Some of us are more or less aware, right, of the impact of watching, for example, the Tyre Nichols video, but also being aware, depending on our own histories. If you're someone who's experienced racial discrimination across your lifespan, this could be
Yeah.
particularly triggering. If you've been pulled over, right, as a Black person
Yeah.
by the police, this can be triggering. And so seeking support, especially from a mental health provider or someone qualified, may be in order, right? And so
Yeah.
whether that's a counseling professional if you're in an academic setting, or someone at your workplace, or someone in the community, even spiritual leaders, right, or
Yeah.
trusted mentors may offer that kind of support. And knowing that you don't have to hold this alone kind of leads us to our ideas around self-care. What is it that promotes healthy sense of mind and body and spirit for folks? And that's going to be different.
Yeah.
That could be sprinting like me. It could be yoga, could be walking, could be cooking,
Yeah.
could be music.
Right.
The last thing I will say, which I think is not often talked about enough, which we included in Racial Trauma is Real, is the power of what we call resistance.
Yeah.
Yeah, experiences of racism and discrimination lead, right, to feelings of helplessness and hopelessness. And so for some folks, the empowerment of being able to do something can be really important so that they are not sort of stuck in this place of racism's not going away. This just keeps happening.
Right.
And so the idea of being connected to social change activities, if that feels important for an individual, and that's why I think the power of protest for some folks is really key. Sometimes it's, just sort of being in community and going to community events where you're around others who are also invested in the idea of, sort of dismantling racism or racial injustices. But there's been a lot of more recent talks about sort of the power of empowerment.
Yeah.
So the idea that when we are connected, that when we really work to fight for racial justice, for example, and that also can promote healing, right? It doesn't leave us in that place of hopelessness or helplessness where we have to exist and sort of succumb to the reality of that versus having the radical hope that we, will work to be a truly multiracial society that lives and exists, right, amongst one another. And that our experiences for people of color with regard to racism and racial discrimination don't always have to be as pervasive as they are. That's what keeps me going, both as a scholar, as a professional, and as a Black woman, quite frankly, is that radical hope. Sometimes it's harder than others to hold on to, but there is something to be said about folks that become invigorated and empowered to do something. And that's the resistance, I think, that we're talking about, the collective strength that comes from that.
Radical hope is a wonderful concept. I'm really, really resonating with it. And it's something that I continue to hold on to. And I appreciate you giving voice and a name to it here today. Thank you so much. I feel like there's so much more that we can dive into, but there's also a lot here to reflect on. And I appreciate you sharing those multi-level strategies, particularly talking about when we go to work or when we go to school, that the institutions that we engage with should recognize that this is not business as usual, particularly for those, who are going to be most affected by this, and space should be made, and that we should be resourcing ourselves with self-care, mindfulness, etc., being in touch with friends and family who are supportive, who can accept whether we want to engage or whether we don't necessarily want to engage, to be okay with what caring for ourselves looks like. For me, it's binge watching cartoons, but for others, it might be running or taking a walk, being connected to spiritual leaders. And then this idea of responding to injustice with radical hope, with legitimate resistance as an aspect of healing. Yeah, all of that is super powerful. So thank you so much. So I want to close on a brighter question. And it's a question that we ask all of our guests. What is giving you life right now, Dr. Jernigan-Noesi?
My son. I actually have a 6-year-old son, and just his joy gives me life, sort of gives me radical hope that I can do my part, right, as a global, right, sort of individual and human to think about the future generations coming after us, and certainly allow him to hold on to his, as I call his Black boy joy, right? But just in general, the joy keeps me going, I think, on the hardest of days. And the idea that we can try to create, right, a better future for the generations after us that keep me going.
That's beautiful. Yeah, you got me thinking about my own 6-year-old. So.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. To our listeners, thank you for joining us for this powerful conversation. You can learn more about Dr. Maryam Jernigan-Noesi and her work at her website, and we've got a link in the show description. And we will also have a link to her racism recovery toolkit. I'm very excited to dive into that. We'll be back next week with the second episode that we taped in Los Cabos, Mexico. This one is with me, Leah and Olivia Johnson, and we're talking about how to make extroverts and introverts comfortable when you're organizing an event, a party, or even a date. So thank you again. Thank you to Dr. Jernigan-Noesi for joining us. Please remember to be kind to yourself, and we'll see you soon. Take care. Peace.